Hey everyone, what is going on? Welcome back to A Man Talks NRL SuperCoach. In today's video, I'm going to be talking through what the teams that I think have got the toughest start to the season. Now, in my previous video, I went through the teams that I thought had the best start to the season and players to target that you might want in your squad. Now, this isn't going to necessarily be players to avoid, but this is more just to give you some food for thought in terms of, realizing that some teams are going to have some pretty tough starts of the year. So, some of the attacking players that you might want to be thinking about, maybe you might have to think again. So, we'll just get into it. All right. So the first three teams that I think have got a pretty tough start to the year, I'm going to be the Broncos, the Bulldogs, and the Sea Eagles. Now, the Broncos, we all know what kind of season they had last year. It was just absolutely disastrous. They ended up with the wooden spoon. I think it was in the final round that they ended up getting that. And it doesn't really start any better for them this year. They've got some off-season drama stuff that we'll touch on a little bit later as well. But just looking at that schedule, they've only really got one game in that six that I think is winnable, which is against the Bulldogs in round 3. But looking at every other game, Eels going to be a tough. At least they're at home, but still the Eels are a pretty good side. The Titans away, the Titans have, loaded up this year, and I feel like the Titans are going to be winning in that game as well. Just after that Bulldogs game in round 3, though, we've got the Storm, the Rabbitohs, and the Panthers. And the Storm and Rabbitohs are both away. Now, the Panthers are at home, but, the Panthers were the best team almost all year, last year. So I feel like that would be a very tough game for them as well. So, looking at that 6-game stretch for the Broncos, I just don't see them winning more than one out of those. Now, in terms of the off-season stuff, obviously they've got a new coach in this year, which is hopefully going to, turn the fortunes around. But, Payne Haas has been, he's had his legal dramas, and I think he's now set to miss the first 3 rounds of the season. So while I've got him in that list because when he's playing, he's the best prop to have in SuperCoach. Given that he's missing the first 3 games, I think you just can't have him at the start in your team to start the season. It's just too much money to be leaving on your bench. So while I've got him in a player to consider, not at the start of the year. Consider him later in the year. So as a result of him not being in there in the team at the first part of the season, I've put in a couple of forwards like Matt Lodge, Pat Carrigan, and Jordan Ricky. Now, I think Matt Lodge at $2.99 is going to be a really, really cheap option that I think a lot of players are going to go after, particularly because Payne Haas is going to be out. So, you'd expect that the minutes then would be shared amongst the rest of the forwards. So he potentially could be a good cash cow option to start the year. Pat Carrigan at $5.92, I think personally myself, I might not go there, but he did have a really good year last year. And, if he's going to be playing again a lot of really high minutes, I think he had a pretty good PPM, and so he could be a good option. But I guess part of the appeal of him last year was that he started out cheap, and he just ended up staying in most people's teams. So I think maybe to start the year might not go for him, but someone to consider, I think. Now Jordan Ricky, I think, is obviously going to be super, super popular. I think people are just going to be waiting on the round 1 team list to see if he's going to be, in the starting forwards. If he is, I think he's going to be a certainty in my team at $278k. Kind of the same reason that I mentioned for Matt Lodge as well. I think with Payne Haas out, all the other forwards are going to have to step up. So you'd expect, a bit more minutes, a bit more tackling and defensive work for them. So I think, someone like Jordan Ricky at $278k is going to be a really, really good cash cow to start the season. Now, in terms of the attacking players of the Broncos, like looking at those 6 games, it's tough to see where the points will come for the Broncos. I think maybe the Bulldogs game, but really I can't really see anywhere else, that they're going to put up a lot of points. So I think really in terms of the backs, I only really thought of Tessie New as a consideration, and that's partly just because of his price. At $233k, he's not going to be eating up a lot of your budget, and I think he might have the starting fullback role, or he'll at least be on the wing. So given that he's going to be in his first 17 and he's a cheap player, I think he's fine to have in your starting squads, just to be a bit of a cash cow option to start the year. Now, Bulldogs, I think there's probably not too much to talk about with the Bulldogs, as you can probably see in my player considerations. So they've again got a pretty tough start to the year as well. I think it's a little bit softer than the Broncos draw, but still not ideal. I mean, in those first 6 games, they've got a game against the Panthers, the Rabbitohs, and the Storm. But, I think those are going to be all pretty tough. Knights and Cowboys, potentially winnable for the Bulldogs. The Bulldogs did win up at Newcastle last year. The game, I think it was a bit of a downpour as well, so the conditions probably maybe went in their favour. And, that Broncos game, it's a 50-50 to which of the two can win that game. Now, in terms of the players, I've got Jake Averillo at 331k. He had a decent year last year as well, and I think he's either going to be in the 5'8" or maybe a center role at the Bulldogs. And I think at 331k, he's not a bad shout, I think, to be putting in your centers. I think at the moment I've got him in my centers as well. So I think he's not a bad shout. I think in terms of other players, obviously Carl Flanagan's now gone to the Bulldogs. I think he's 500k plus. So I think given that their start to the year is pretty tough, I'm not sure if I'm going to have him in my starting halves. I think there are better options out there as well. He does have the goal kicking though, I guess, which does boost his appeal. But just looking at that tough start to the year, for me, I don't think I'll be going for Carl Flanagan. And to be honest, didn't really think of anyone else with the Bulldogs. I think you can get Jared Anderson, who's I think he's the old SuperCoach faithful, 173k dual position cheapie that you can just keep on your bench. So you can go for him as well, I guess. And then moving on to the Sea Eagles. So I think, again, they've got a pretty tough start in those first 4 games against the Roosters, Rabbitohs and the Panthers. They do have the Dragons though, which I think is going to be a winnable game for them as well. And it does soften up a little bit with the Warriors and the Titans. But I think overall, if you look at that 6-game stretch, it's a pretty tough start to the year for the Sea Eagles. But, they've got a few players who I think are going to be really, really popular. Obviously, Trbojevic, I think, is going to be in so many teams. Just looking at that price of 590k, he's the cheapest he's been in a long, long time. So I think even though, despite those tough games, you'd expect someone like Trbojevic to always be getting the points. So I think he'll probably be in my starting team, despite the tough start to the year as well. But maybe just lower your expectations potentially a little bit. Obviously, he's got the potential to score in any game, but with those tougher games, he might not be hitting those massive scores, but he'll tick along for you, I think, to start the year. Cherry Evans, obviously, I think was probably the second best performing halfback last year in SuperCoach. 570k, it's not a bad price, I think, but given that tough start to the year, I just don't know if he'll be the one that I'll go for in the halves. Andrew Davey at 337k, I think is going to be a really, really popular, cheap, mid-range second row option. I think he is predicted to be in the starting second row. And I think with the loss of Adam Fanua-Blake, that probably means that, the other forwards are going to all have to step up now, kind of take the share of his workload that they're going to miss. So I think he's going to be a really, really popular cash cow option to start the year as well. So I think, again, with forwards, it's less dependent, I think, on how tough the opponent is, because they're kind of relying more on base stats. So I think he'd be a good option. I think I'll get him in my starting lineup when I start the year. And Jason Saab, I've got there at 233k. So he's, I think, predicted to be on one of the wings for Manly. So I think, again, cheap price, starting 17. It's good to have at the start of the year, just for a bit of a cash cow option. But I wouldn't expect too many points to start the year, to be honest. And Josh Schuster at 203k. I think he's predicted to be the starting 5'8" for Manly. I think he's a good option too, given that, he's so cheap that even though he don't have to really score that many points to be able to make him money to start the year. So I think even though those games are tough, I think he's a good player to consider. So we'll move on to the next 3. So starting off with the Sharks. Now the Sharks are a really, really, I think, a team I'm going to really try to avoid. The loss of Sean Johnson for, I think, the first 7 to 8 rounds just makes the Sharks just not appealing to me as a team I'd want to be getting players from. I think there's really only a couple of players that I would consider, given that, they've got the Raiders, Eels and Roosters all in the first 6 games. They do have a bit of some easier games with Dragons and Cowboys, potentially the Knights as well, depending how they go, but obviously the Knights are really inconsistent, so it's tough to kind of predict, any game with them. Obviously Matt Moylan at 254k, I think he's going to be really, really popular, just given that, he's in the past, he's been able to average, I think, 60 plus. But for me, he's just given that those tough games, and I think his injury history, I'm just not sure if he's going to be one that I'm going to go for. And another one I've got there is Connor Tracy at 258k. So I think he's predicted to either be the fullback or the 5'8". We're not quite sure yet. We'll have to look at the round 1 team lists. But I think he does have the dual flexibility of being a 5'8" or a halfback in SuperCoach, which is pretty handy. So I think 258k, he could be your bench half or 5'8" option. But yeah, again, wouldn't be expecting so many points, looking at that there's 3 tough games in there. But, there are 3 games in there that potentially are winnable as well. Now, moving on to the Storm, I will caveat the fact that, yes, while I think that the Storm have a pretty tough start to the year, it's also the Storm who are the premiers, so I think they can beat anyone on their day, obviously. So I would just keep that in the back of your mind. So even though the games are tough, you can still expect the Storm to be winning most of their games. But looking at that, 4 of the top 6 from last year are playing in their first opponents for them in the first 6 games of the season. Rabbitohs, Eels, Panthers, and the Roosters. And the Eels and the Panthers are both away, so that does make it a little bit tougher for the Storm. But then again, they've got those in round 4 and 5. They've got Broncos and Bulldogs back to back, which is the 2 teams you'd want to be targeting, I think. So I think despite the Storm's tough first 3 games, I think it's always a safe bet going for their players. So I've kind of put down some of the more obvious ones. I think like Harry Grant is going to be super, super popular. I think given the news on Cam McInnes now having done his ACL, he'll be out for the entire season. So I think, Harry Grant is going to become even a more popular option, because I think a lot of people would have been looking at McInnes, Cook, and Grant as they're kind of the most 3 popular. I think now that McInnes is gone for the year, I reckon Grant's going to be a super, super popular option. It's going to be him and McCook are going to be the top 2 hookers, in my opinion. Obviously guys like Cameron Munster, Ryan Pappenhausen, I think, they're big game players, so it doesn't matter if the opponent's tough. I think you can always expect them to do well. Just like Cam Munster, if he gets goal kicking, I think is a really good option. I have a feeling though that Pappenhausen is going to be the one, because I think Munster doesn't have a great record at goal kicking. But, again, good options to have in your team. Pappenhausen, I might not go for him, just because the games are a little bit tougher. And I think, Trbojevic is cheaper than Pappenhausen, and I'm probably going to want to get Tedesco in my team as well. So I've got a strong feeling that Tedesco and Turbo are going to be my starting fullbacks. But, that does make maybe Pappenhausen a bit more of a pod option, point of difference, given that I think most people are going to be trying to go for Tedesco and Turbo to start the year. Christian Welch, I've got, 450k is one kind of like that mid-range front row option. I have seen him in a lot of teams, and I think that's because, with the loss of Tino, potentially he would have more workload in the forwards. But for me, I just have to, add his stats okay, but they're just not amazing. And I think 450k, it's a bit of like an awkward price, I think, for a front rower, when I'd probably be looking for, if I wanted a mid-range option, I'd probably be looking maybe in the 300s. And then I'd probably want to be getting like a gun 500k plus front rower. So for me, he's kind of like an awkwardly priced, and I don't think he'll be in my team, but I have seen him in a lot of teams as well. With these tough games, you could make the argument that his defensive work would be higher, so he could actually have a pretty strong start to the year at least. And Ramus Smith, 325k, I think he's potentially going to be the player to take up Vunivalu's wing spot. Obviously, I think there's Isaac Lumi who will also be contesting the spot. So again, one of those times where we have to just kind of wait for the round 1 team list to see who's going to be taking that wing position. But, if we find out that he does get that position, he's a good player to consider. Maybe what I would do with him is, given that the first 3 games are pretty tough and you might not think that the Storm might score as many points as, they could, you can use those first 3 games to kind of assess how he performs. And, if he potentially does maybe drop in value, it'd be a good time to pick him up in round 4 and 5, because then they've got those 2 really great games against the Broncos and the Bulldogs back to back. And you could actually take that approach with the likes of Munster and Pappenhausen as well. If you think that they're going to underperform their average, they might drop in value by round 4, and then you pick them back up for the really easy games. So I think that's not actually a bad strategy to adopt if you feel that they might not do so well to start the year. And finally, we're moving on to the Tigers. Now, the Tigers have just got such a bad start as well. They've got the Raiders, the Roosters, Eels, and Rabbitohs all in their first 6 games. That's all tough opponents. And then even the Knights as well, again, kind of inconsistent. They potentially could have won that game against the Cowboys, but it's tough to say as well. And obviously the Tigers have lost like Harry Grant, who was their best player, I think, last year as well. But despite all this, I think the Tigers actually do have a few interesting options, particularly on the cheaper side of things, which I think are going to be really, really popular in a lot of people's teams to start the year. Starting off with Jacob Little at 247k, I think he's going to probably be the most popular cheap hooker option that I'm going to see in a lot of teams. And it's for good reason. I think, obviously with Harry Grant leaving, I think it's either going to be between him and Jake Simpkin as the starting hooker. And I think NRL has predicted that Little is going to be the starting hooker. So you can actually expect, with those tougher games, you'd expect more defensive work, which means more tackles, which means more points, which means for a cheapie, more money for us, which we all like. So I think he's probably actually going to be my bench hooker as well. So I think it's, again, wait on round 1 team list to see kind of if he is a starter, and maybe keep an eye out to see if there's any topic on his minutes, and because I think apparently he might not play the full 80. He'll probably maybe share some minutes with Simpkin as well. Speaking of Simpkin, I haven't got him in this list, but he's 173k hooker option as well. So potentially if you're trying to save some money in your team and trying to scrape some extra cash to upgrade one of your other players in another position, you potentially could downgrade Little to Simpkin, who's a whole 70 something k cheaper. So obviously he would probably be playing less minutes than Little, I would expect, but if you're trying to save some money, then I think Simpkin could be an option that you go for instead. In terms of the forwards, obviously we've got Stefano Otokumanu and Sean Bloor. I think these two are probably going to be a lock for my team to start the year. I think both are predicted to be in the 17. Sean Bloor is, I think, predicted to be starting, and Otokumanu like the number 17 kind of role. I think at those kind of prices, you really just have to kind of go for them if you know that they're going to be in the 17, because you'd expect with those games more defensive work, more tackles. So I think those are two really safe, good options that you can have in terms of cash cows. Now I've got in David Nofaluma there at 670k. Now I wouldn't actually consider him. I've just got him here, and that I know that he obviously had an amazing year last year, scoring I think 17 tries. But for me, I think to start the year, given those tough games, I just don't think I'll be going there, because I don't expect them to be putting up a lot of points against the Raiders, Roosters, Eels, Rabbitohs, maybe against the Cowboys and maybe against the Knights. But I think on the whole, that 6-game stretch is pretty tough. Now obviously Nofaluma, he's got really good floor, because he does a lot of work coming out of his own end. He does a lot of offloading as well, so he's good for those kind of points. But I think if you're really trying to get the upside on him, it's when he scores the tries, getting line breaks and such. And I just don't see how many he's going to get in those 6 games. I'm not saying he's not going to score a single try in those 6 games. I think he definitely will score a try. But I wouldn't see those massive scores that we were seeing him getting last year. And I think at 670k, I think it's a bit too expensive for my liking to have in a starting centre position. So for me, he's just not going to be an option, I think, to start the year. But I think, again, this is potentially a good opportunity where in those 6 games that are really tough, he hopefully drops in price, and then we can pick him up later when the schedule gets a bit nicer for the Tigers. And finally, Dane Laurie. So he's a new signing that the Tigers have done, with the Panthers. They've swapped over Paul Momirovski, and they've acquired Dane Laurie. I think at 223k, that does actually really make him enticing, because I think he's predicted to either be, he's predicted to be in the starting fullback role. So while those games are tough, again, it's one of those things where he's so cheap that if he's starting, I think it's always good to have at the start of the year, because that just means, because you want your cheap options to be playing start of the year, because you want them to make you money, and then down the line you can then be trading them, either upgrading them to the the more premium players, or just downgrading to complete like bottom basement players to make you some money as well. So I think Dane Laurie, again, one of those things. Let's keep an eye out on the round 1 team lists, and if we find out that he's going to be in your starting 17, I think he's a really, really safe pick. Alright guys, well that's it. We've covered the 6 teams who I think have got the toughest start to the 2021 season. Hopefully you guys found some use out of that. Again, I will just remember, keep in the back of your mind that the players, some of the players that I've suggested, with tough starts, I think they're still going to do well regardless of opponent. The likes of Grant, Munster, Pappenhausen. But there's just going to be some other players like Nofaluma, who potentially might not do as well, given that their style of play, their points are based on attacking output, and they just might not get that against, teams which have got better defenses, like the guys in the top 6 of last year. If you haven't seen my previous video, I went through the 10 teams that had good starts of the year, or the 10 teams that I thought, in my opinion, had good starts of the year. You can check out that video as well. But until then, I'll see you guys in the next video.